Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Karen Carboner, and I am president of the Walt Whitman Initiative. I'm very proud to introduce the inaugural presentation in our Robust American Love speaker series. It's entitled Walt Whitman, Racism and American Literature with Matt Miller and Lavelle Porter. As a nonprofit organization dedicated to cultural activism and representing the democratic, open-armed ideals Whitman celebrates in his poetry, the Walt Whitman Initiative has actively engaged in many timely conversations, movements, and actions. The issue we're discussing tonight is surely one of the most important and timely conversations that we have participated in. We decided to offer this speaker series, note the word speaker, not lecture, to present timely, public-facing conversations on Whitman's life, work, and legacy. You will hear conversations and enjoy presentations by teachers, poets, graduate students, artists, printers, neighborhood activists, you name it. They're not designed to be academic, but free, open, and informal, using your own input. That is, if you watch them live on Thursday evenings from 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We invite your questions, and we intend to hold at least 15 minutes or so at the end of each of these conversations for Q&A. You can also watch these presentations later at the Walt Whitman Initiative's YouTube channel. Go to our website and see what's coming up, including next week. Jesse Morandi and I are presenting on connecting with Whitman's Brooklyn, walking tours and mobile games. So please don't miss us, August 20th, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern. And in a couple of weeks from then, very excited about this, a presentation by our own Tristan Pullen called Songs of Memories, a conversation about the creation of a Whitmanic play and the queer life of Walt Whitman. You do not want to miss that, September 3rd, 6 to 7 p.m. by Tristan Pullen, who actually designed my green screen here and also does a lot of our wonderful media posters and art. He's fantastic. So shout out to Tristan. Today, I'm very honored to introduce two amazing people, one of whom I know very well, and the other whom I wish to know better. So I'll start with Matt, who is an associate professor of English at Yeshiva University in Manhattan, where he teaches American literature and creative writing. His work on Whitman includes a very important book called Collage of Myself, Walt Whitman and the Making of Leaves of Grass. Most Whitman scholars know this book very well, very important in my own work as well. And he just finished a book co-edited with Zach Turpin called Every Hour, Every Atom, a collection of Walt Whitman's early notebooks and fragments. So look out for that from the University of Iowa. And then there is Lavelle Porter, a writer and scholar of African American literature. He is an assistant professor of English at the New York City College of Technology of CUNY. And he just published last year, The Blackademic Life, Academic Fiction, Higher Education, and the Black Intellectual. Talk about timely. Check out that new publication from Lavelle. And he also penned this very important article called Should Walt Whitman Be Canceled? Black America Talks Back to the Good Gray Poet at 200. That was for JSTOR Daily. And that is the inspiration for this particular presentation today. I have a final word to offer. I'm saying thank you, of course, to Lavelle and to Matt, but I also must thank the people behind the scenes, which includes Tristan Pullen and our own Jesse Morandi, who is the vice president of the Whitman Initiative, and our tech guru. So without Jesse, none of this would happen. Please watch out for his work. He has done this incredible mobile-based experience called Vanishing Leaves, which was actually the first digital dissertation at CUNY, and he will be talking about that next week. So please don't miss him. So thank you, Jesse. Thank you to our speakers, and I'm going to hand it over now to Matt and Lavelle. Thanks again, guys.
All right. Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. Lavelle, thank you for agreeing to do this talk. I really appreciate it. We all do. I thought we might begin with your article.
Okay.
I had an interesting introduction to someone. It was making the rounds quickly through Whitman scholars. Everybody was talking about it. But for some reason, it was introduced to me as the article. They described it by the title, Should Walt Whitman Be Canceled? And I didn't get your name with it. So I had no idea that you had written it when I looked it up on JSTOR. So I saw your name there and I was like, wow. Uh, so, I was kind of biased toward it. Lavelle and I have known each other for about 11 years. And so I thought I would take the opportunity of Lavelle's timely and important article to ask him to join me in this conversation. So I guess I'll start with just a kind of question for you, Lavelle. What's the reaction to the article been like? How has it set with you?
Yeah, well, thanks also to you for inviting me to come and talk about this, and to Karen and Jesse and Tristan for helping to put it together. I was actually kind of surprised that it did circulate among so many women scholars. It was, in some ways very gratifying. I wanted to make sure I got it right. And, the fact that, you said that the people that you knew were talking about it, I thought, okay, I must have hit on something here. So it was, I've written pieces for JSTOR Daily before, and I was asked if I had an idea for a piece for National Poetry Month in April that year. And this had been kind of percolating in my mind for a while. I've taught Whitman before. I knew about Timothy McNair's protests of singing the Whitman song. And so I just been kind of taking notes about this for a while. I also saw the book Whitman Noir, which was really, the catalyst for all this. They started out as a kind of a review of that book. But, when I was asked to do it or to come up with an idea, I just thought, it's Whitman 200. I'd kind of been thinking about maybe I could write something for Whitman 200. And it all came together from there. So yeah, it's been interesting to see the reactions to it. With that title and cancel in the title, that gets people's attention, obviously. I'm not really a clickbait writer, but this was like my attempt to try to write some clickbait. And it definitely worked in, all kinds of ways that were unexpected and some that were expected. Some people just reacted to the title. That's how clickbait works, So you get a lot of clicks from people who just want to rant about the title.
Yeah.
But also people seem to really read and engage with it too. And so I got some interesting feedback, kind of more feedback than I usually get from things that I write. So there was a point at which I just kind of like didn't follow some of those conversations. I just I don't want to know what people are saying at this point. They're reading it, so that's fine with me.
So you explicitly chose the cancel framework and titling to get eyeballs on the article?
Yeah, I mean, it was irrelevant. There've been conversations. And, one of the things we kind of talked about before this was, would I have written it in, right now in this moment in the same way? I'm not sure I would have, because that word has become so much more obnoxious in just a few months since then. I probably would have I don't want to write anything. I don't want to hear the word cancel or woke ever again in my life. If I did that, I'd be fine.
Yeah.
But at the time, yeah, it seemed like a good idea to kind of, to hook people in, but also, there was some substance behind it, I hope.
Oh yeah, and it totally worked. You hooked people in. And I thought the way you contextualized it in the article was really well done and helpful. How it's used sort of half comically to indicate, an attitude in some ways. I mean, it's about negotiation of the present, but it's also about what, in particular, younger people, are going to think about people that older, like myself, artists that we respect. So. Yeah. I like how you put it in context, and I think it helps. So some people that first started hearing that word, I don't think people got that it was meant partially ironically. Mm-hmm. A lot of people took it more literally. Yeah. And you comment on that. I thought that was one of the important.
Yeah. I do read some of the comments, and it was these people, they want to cancel everybody, and these people are so sensitive, and if you cancel Walt Whitman, I'll cancel you, and those sorts of comments go around there.
Oh, wow. Because I thought it was really clear to me in your article that this was coming from a position of conflicted feelings. This wasn't a attempt to dismiss Whitman. Mm-hmm. There's an undercurrent of respect for his work, I thought, that animated it, along with healthy skepticism. And so I'm surprised that people didn't see that this was a article at least partly written out of love.
they didn't want to see it. You know, some people just react to, that's why I said in the article that, you know, I don't really think cancel culture is a thing. And some people even reacted to that. Like, this person says that cancel culture isn't real, and that's you know, whatever.
Oh, so you're getting it from both sides.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
So I understand that one of the things that influenced you in that article was Marcos Gonzalez's essay, Recognizing the Enduring Whiteness of Jane Austen. Could you talk a bit about how that influenced you?
Well, it was the other way around, actually. Marco cited my essay. Yeah, that piece came later. And I think it was in some ways, an even more thorough and better treatment of the same concept through reading Jane Austen. And Marcos is also a CUNY Graduate Center alum. And yeah, it's a great piece about what it means to read this work from the perspective, particularly as writers and scholars of color. You know, we want our students to engage with this work. The idea is, you know, these writers are universal, and therefore we want all our students to read them. But we also have to think, what does it mean for, you know, as a Mexican American, as he is, to read Jane Austen? What does it mean for our Black students to encounter Whitman and see some of those comments that Timothy McNair saw? You know, I think it's important to contextualize these writers for those students to help them understand the complexity of these issues that they were dealing with in their time, you know. And Whitman is just a perfect symbol of that, because he's someone, and as I said in the article, you know, partly what makes this so vexing is that he's our poet of democracy. You know, he was somebody who was supposed to be the most inclusive writer, and yet you see in his, you know, private writings, there's comments that are very just outright racist. You know, and it doesn't quite square with what you see in The Body Electric, where he's writing that beautiful section about, you know, seeing slave auction and identifying with the enslaved on the auction block.
Yeah, definitely. I know what you mean. There was one quote in particular from Gonzalez's essay that you brought up, that there was a part of it that I wanted to share with our audience because I thought it was so well put. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to share it?
Yeah, I can read that.
All right, great.
I want to read Austen. I want to read as many dead white writers as I can. I have a voracious appetite to read literature from every historical period and place on this planet, but I must read them from this body built of colonization, this body built from the pillaging and massacring and dispossessing of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, this body hundreds of years in the making, which I now read from. Those like and unlike me are there in those pages. Yeah, and so that's it. I mean, I can only read this from my perspective, and I think we want students to read this from the perspective, and not just from some sort of false notion of colorblindness or universality. So I thought there was a really interesting engagement with the sort of canonical writers and how our students of color encounter that kind of work.
It was a really powerful statement to me too. The encompassing nature of it struck me, and it made me wonder, you know, what it would mean to do that, to read from that position, and how that would be different from how the ways that, for example, I've read Whitman before, and you know, how exactly does that impact us? One thing it does for me is it sensitizes me to the way that Whitman uses power in his descriptions, and the way he takes power through his descriptions. Sometimes he gives it back, or tries to. And it also makes me think about the larger project that like Romantic literature was involved with in trying to envision this like positive future for humanity, this like utopian future. Yeah. Especially the very young Whitman, it seems to me, was very much caught up with that idea that there could be this better world out there. And in his earlier years, I say early, he was still in his 30s, he wasn't that young, up until he was, you know, when he was writing Leaves of Grass when he was 34, 35, you know, he seemed to have a somewhat more inclusive vision of humanity that could encompass, you know, Black people, slaves and former slaves. But that seems to fade and grow and spoil and become more increasingly racist after the Civil War. So I guess one question I have is, what does it mean to read literature in that way? How does the way that Gonzalez suggests, how does that affect our readings? And then also, you know, how does Whitman fit in specifically to that?
Well, I kind of wanted to throw that back to you as someone who's studied his notebooks, because we viewed Ed Folsom's talk last, I guess it was in July, on the subject, and he talked a little bit about how, you know, there was the Whitman the poet, and then there's Whitman himself, whose thinking about race didn't always match the inclusivity of the poetry. What about his notebooks? What have you learned from reading his notebooks that you think is applicable here?
Well, I did just reread all of his pre-Civil War notebooks with the Whitman scholar Zachary Turpin for the book that Karen mentioned in the introduction. And, you know, the Whitman that comes through in those notebooks is someone that you can respect and someone that you can usually kind of cheer on in his views. First of all, race doesn't come up as much as it does in his Reconstruction era writing. When it does, it's often in the context of his erotic descriptions of men's bodies.
Yeah.
It seems to be included in a kind of queer utopian poetics, is why I brought up the idea of utopia earlier. Right now, I'm reading this book by Mark Doty called What is the Grass? Mm-hmm. And Doty talks at length about this kind of like queer utopian vision, which he associates explicitly with cruising, gay male sexual activity, and this. He sees Whitman as finding a kind of liberatory vision in his liberated sexual attitudes, and that those two things are intrinsically tied together. And when his erotic fascination fades, so too does his ability to include people in what Doty calls the American family. So I think that it's troubling too, right? I mean, this is a guy, I mean, on the one hand, Whitman, you know, as a queer writer was oppressed himself and couldn't, you know, he lived his life in the closet, but on the other hand, you know, he was looking at these people that were, you know, when he visited the South, he saw a slave auction, probably more than one. These are people completely at the mercy of the auctioneer and the gaze of people like Whitman, standing there appraising, you know, that black body. And that's where poems like I Sing the Body Electric comes from. And the Whitman I love and respect is the Whitman that can transform that into an occasion for celebration of humanity in general, and for arguing that we all share the same a kind of common right to live, and a right to be free of violence and oppression. Yeah. But sadly, you know, that Whitman seems to increasingly kind of fade away after the Civil War. And it's a question that's perplexed many Whitman scholars. Ed tried to address it, Ed Folsom, during that talk, and others have addressed it, but I don't think anyone's ever done a completely satisfying job of it. To me, it's still a troubling, vexing question that, you know, I struggle with.
And that's something I really tried to address in that article too, is the importance of recognizing Whitman's queerness. He, in some ways, is not just another dead white male writer. You know, he's, I think, with some scholars, been included in the canon, but we need to really recover how that inclusion happened and how long it took. Because at the time, he wasn't really considered, you know, legitimate writer. I mean, because of the style of his poetry, because of the things that are in the poems themselves. You know, he was a degenerate, using the language of that time. And is not somebody who really would be considered, you know, included in the American ideal of masculinity, you know? So I think in some ways, to read him, you know, we need to recover that. Don't just really talk about him as this great writer, but as someone who was really a kind of dissident in his time, definitely a dissident in his time. His writing, you know, got him fired. You know, people thought the poetry was obscene. And he was seen as an icon for, you know, queer intellectuals who read his work and really saw the expression of sexuality that's in it.
Yeah, exactly. And it complicates for me the question of how we treat his racist statements, which are explicitly racist. Mm-hmm. And, you know, on the one hand, I can understand why some people would want to reject that. And I don't hold that against anyone. If anybody chooses not to read or teach Whitman, I get it. You know, I get it. For me personally, he still speaks to me powerfully and has proven as a useful teaching tool to bring up all kinds of things, including race. And some of the best conversations I've had in classes have been about poems like I Sing the Body Electric. So I reserve the right to continue to teach him, and I continue to read him with pleasure, and I'm not embarrassed by that. but I can't say that I don't feel uncomfortable when I read those statements.
Yeah.
There's a temptation to kind of separate the poetry from the prose, especially the journalism and the unpublished writing that some of these statements comes from. That's another tricky issue. I struggle with that as well. Should we separate the man from the poem? Is that being too generous? I mean, I don't know.
I don't think with Whitman, definitely not. I mean, his poetry resists that the very kind of separation of the body from the
this book touches a man.
Yeah. And I think his position as his class status, I think, is important here too. I mean, he was someone who was a working class writer at a time when, nobody really read those kinds of writers. He self-published, this book. He wasn't part of the literary establishment. He was racist, as many people were in his time. White supremacy was really the default among white people. And so he was very much, a man of his times. That was kind of one of the comebacks that, we talked about in the Ed Folsom's talk. Is this just a case of someone being, a person of their times, and how can we expect people to be different from the environment in which they live? But I think it's, as someone who is himself, like I said, not really part of a sort of elite as a writer, I think that's an interesting way of looking at him. He was really a working class poet who built this work on his own, to the point of actually printing it, physically on his own.
For sure. I mean, among what you might call, canonical poets, like central canonical poets, from that kind of old school perspective, right? Whitman, as far as I know, was the first to come from a working class background, at least among Anglophone writers. Yeah. The British Romantics, not a single one of the better known British Romantics came from a lower middle class. As some have argued, he wasn't really working class, but more of a kind of lower. His father was kind of a real estate speculator, and they would buy properties, fix them up. He had carpentry skills, and they would sell them. So yeah, they worked, and they were working. Certainly, they were working class from a Marxist point of view.
Yeah.
And
that perspective. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I'm not. You go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that that also is important context for his racist comments. I mean, he was someone who was not a slaveholder. I contrast him with Thomas Jefferson, who also teach in American literature. And in some ways, I'm much harsher on Jefferson, because he was someone who actually held human beings as his property, who sexually assaulted the women that he owned. There was no consent involved in that. So there's in some ways I'll give Whitman a little more leeway than I do some of the other dead white men that I teach in my classes.
And I think that if you do read the poems without that prose, there are plenty of occasions to celebrate Whitman's racial attitude in the poetry, at least. I know that in his time, from reading the reviews of the first and second editions, especially of Leaves of Grass, when Southern literary journals reviewed his book, they immediately identified Whitman as an abolitionist, and he was attacked consistently throughout his life by Southern literati for his pro-slave, pro-Black views. They had no doubt in their mind that he was their enemy.
Yeah.
From that point of view, at least, it's a bit ironic that Whitman has now come to be emblematic of the dead white male, oppressive dead white male culture, at least in some people's minds. It certainly is a reversal of how he was seen in the late 1850s.
And his, adoration of Lincoln, I think, was part of that, right? I mean, he was someone who very much was supportive of the Union.
Yeah.
And he and Lincoln, I think, are very similar. There's a very similar conversation to be had about Abraham Lincoln. There's the way that Lincoln historically became the great emancipator, right? But then we also know that Lincoln didn't necessarily see Black people as equals, and didn't really expect that Black people would be fully integrated into the American body politic. So he's just like his Redeemer president. Sure. There's a lot of similarities between them.
And there was a lot of that going around. I mean, really, I can't think of a single white author that successfully envisioned a biracial America in the Reconstruction era. It's a point that Ed Folsom brought up during his talk, that how long did we wait? Are we still waiting for a white author to envision a successful biracial America in a work of fiction. We have,
I don't think we really need that. I mean, that's why I focused on, we do. I mean, obviously I want people to be, to persuade, but I really wanted to focus on the Black intellectuals who saw Whitman too, and to see their perspective. That's why I talked about Langston Hughes and Natasha Trethewey and Joseph Kimiaka,
The white people need it, is what I meant, I guess.
Yeah.
More than, yeah. So we talked a little bit about that. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I asked you about who you think among African-American authors has had that kind of utopian vision and how it differs from Whitman's and other white writers' utopian visions. And I think you brought up Sam Delaney as a great example of a science fiction writer who has some similarities in that he has his own kind of queer utopia.
Yeah, he's, utopia is a interesting term in Delaney's work because he's in some ways anti-utopian as well. Or heterotopia as the word that he uses in his book Triton. He's another great, bearded queer New York writer. I was reading, my other work is on Delaney. Been a big fan of his and, done some scholarship on his work. And I really think about Times Square Red, Times Square Blue and the idea of contact. When I read Whitman, that's what really resonated with me. Like, oh, he's talking about some of the similar, coming from a similar perspective as Delaney does when in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, he talks about cities and the importance of contact that happens in cities versus networking, which is a more formalized kind of interaction. What really makes cities dynamic is the contact that you have with people across races and ethnicities and classes. And Whitman's idea of the stranger, and the encounter with strangers is something that really, I think both of those writers have in common.
That makes a lot of sense. And that also might be a piece in the puzzle of helping to explain how his views changed. When he moves away from New York, first to DC and the horrors that he saw there in the Civil War hospitals. And then, later, eventually to Camden, he didn't have that dense crush of people and that like conflux of bodies to inspire him. I wonder how much the loss of that affected his way of looking at it. I know that you, one of the ways that you've brushed up against Whitman in your daily life is when you were giving tour guide tours to people and you would give kind of, as I understand it, like literary tours of New York and Manhattan.
Yeah.
Was that kind of how you first got into Whitman?
Yeah, I came to Whitman kind of late. That was, something I mentioned when we were talking before. I really it was the American Experience documentary that introduced me to Whitman. So that was 2008. And it happened to hit me at the right time because I was also studying as a tour guide. And so, reading about this New Yorker who celebrated the dynamism of city life in the 19th century, which, many people saw as something foreboding and this is the wrong way for humanity to go. He really embraced it. So working as a tour guide, as I was learning about New York City history, I also began to learn about Whitman. And I've incorporated some of those sites into my classes. We're in downtown Brooklyn at City Tech. So I've taken my students over to Walt Whitman Park. We've gone over to the Brooklyn Bridge Park and the Fulton Ferry Landing, read Crossing Brooklyn Ferry while standing right there. We've been to Fort Greene and, Fort Greene Park where the Centenarian story takes place. And there's his house on Ryerson Street, which there's now some conversation about making that a historic site. So the geography of New York was something that drew me into Whitman too. And I'm really excited to see Jesse's talk because I saw when his dissertation came out and some of the coverage that got. And so I'm really excited to hear more about that too.
Jesse and Karen are giving a talk in a week on Walt Whitman's New York and the urban context of Whitman's poems. That's what Lavelle was just referring to just a second ago. So yeah, another thing I wanted to talk to you about and kind of getting back to that idea of Whitman's queer utopia and how that enabled him to have a less racist attitude and a more liberating attitude toward people. I went through the the Word doc version of the recent book of notebooks that came out, and I did word searches for words like slave, black, race, and so on. Mm-hmm. And the thing that struck me was how seldom it comes up. I counted about 4 times. And of those times, it's almost always in the context of descriptions of bodies. It's not about politics. It's not about finding a place for Black people after slavery. It's not even about being worried about the Civil War and what it's going to do to the America that Whitman loved. It's about aesthetic appreciation of Black bodies. And on the one hand, I have, again, mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, it's encouraging to see him talk in a way that suggests feelings of equality and compassion. But on the other hand, it's kind of squirmy stuff, the way he subjects these people to his gaze. And there's a kind of privilege there too, that it's tricky kind of privilege, because he's also oppressed, as you pointed out, I don't know what to make of it exactly. It makes me...
It's dehumanizing. That's dehumanizing for sure.
Yeah.
Especially given, again, the political status of Black people at that time, but it's complicated. I mean, we understand race through embodiment and sexuality. That's something that I get a lot from Delaney's work, right? That these sexual differences are one of the ways in which we understand racial difference, and they're closely related. And so I think as a teacher, you can sort of draw that out to your students to, and there's plenty of scholarship that covers that topic of the relationship between race and sexuality, and the way Black people are viewed as sexually deviant and differently gendered. And I think Walt Whitman is kind of participating in that, based on what you said about his comments in the journals.
I think that's something I hadn't thought about it from quite that angle. That's really interesting to me. So maybe Whitman felt a sense of fellow feeling with the fact that his desires were also unsanctioned. They were, they couldn't see the light of day, and he had no rights in terms of, what he wanted from life. He just had to deal with it. And so maybe that's a source of his fellow feeling in his early years somewhat. I'm not sure, but
yeah, I mean, it's clearly it's his desire. I mean, just thinking about it in terms of just naked desire, he saw those folks as desirable. But our, desires happen within historical context. And so it's not just an innocent thing, he just happened to be attracted to Black people. But what does that mean for, like you said, a white man to be talking about Black people's bodies in this way when Black people themselves are completely disenfranchised? There's a certain kind of condescension and a power difference there that has to be acknowledged.
And that, that power difference, it occurs to me that power difference continued through his Civil War years too, where for all the good he did as a Civil War caretaker and nurse-like figure in those hospitals, again, he was the one in complete control. These were often dying people, dying men in their hospital beds. And while he was playing the caretaker role and he did some good, again, it's him in the position of power.
Yeah.
That's not something I've really thought about too much. It's interesting. So I've been reading your book, The Blackademic Life. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that strikes me about it that it's kind of drawing me in and making me think a lot more about the subject is the way you talk about just how long the white prejudice has been embedded in Black education, how from the very beginning, the earliest moments of Black education in the United States, it's always been about control and about approving certain feelings as acceptable within society, maintaining the borders of what's acceptable. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and if you see any of that kind of attitude towards education, because that's also something Whitman wrote about a lot, was education and how America could change if people weren't so tied to Christian views and so on. So I was wondering if you could connect that to Whitman at all.
Well, I could, draw on one of his contemporaries, Frederick Douglass, and I quote from Frederick Douglass's narrative there. And Douglass really articulated the relationship between knowledge and power when he told that anecdote about his enslaver's mistress or a wife wanting to teach him how to read, and then the slaveholder said, you can't teach him how to read. If you teach him how to read, he'll forever be out of our control. And so there's a real relationship between, literacy and power and knowledge and power. And Douglas drew that out, and other Black writers also paid attention to that as well. That book tries to trace a history of Black education and higher education specifically, and attitudes towards higher education among Black people and among white people too. And many people saw, the higher education of Black people as a kind of social danger. Even, concern trolling Black people about it as a danger to themselves. Like, if you become educated like this, you're not going to be able to be employed ever again because nobody's going to want to hire someone who's uppity and thinks too much of himself. So, that book, I try to trace a history of higher education and people's attitudes towards it. And I think when it comes to Whitman, the way you're talking about the way he eroticized Black people, partly what happens when that eroticization happens is, a lack of understanding or appreciation for the interiority of Black people. And that's really what I focus on here is, looking at this literature on education, you see an expression of the Black interior in a way that you don't see in any other literary forms in America, at least.
I guess the only thing I could think of where Whitman does demonstrate any even attempt at awareness of what you just called Black interiority is in some of the passages where he describes runaway slaves and the terror that they would experience.
Yeah.
Has been given some credit for being the first white poet to speak from the position or speak with the voice of a Black slave. White scholars have praised Whitman for that. I guess that's the closest I can think of for him doing. It's obviously insufficient.
A scholarly question I have: is there any evidence that he actually encountered a runaway enslaved person? Because I've taught that my students just talk about it as matter of factly. Whitman tended to this runaway slave in his house. I'm like, well, that's a sort of a character in the poem and not necessarily him. But is there any evidence that that was something that he had experienced?
I don't know. He didn't. I think so. He wasn't a part of the Underground Railroad in any active way that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
There are some stories going back to his youth about growing up around slaves when slavery was legal. When he was very, very young on the Whitman house on Long Island, that supposedly there were slaves around or recently freed slaves around, people who had at one time been slaves. But as far as runaway slaves, that is, I think, a fiction.
Okay.
Like many of the things in Leaves of Grass, he derived it from newspaper accounts, which he would steal phrases from to collage together his poems.
Yeah.
And
I have to shout out to your book, Collage of Myself, for people who aren't familiar with it. It's a really great interpretation of how Whitman worked as a collage artist, basically, before collage was even a thing,
Thanks, I appreciate that. I'm still kind of proud of that book and hoping it continues to influence people. But I also feel a little bit embarrassed by it now in the sense that I don't know. I wish somehow I could have made that book more socially engaged and less just so text. I'm hoping that with my next book, I can look out at the world a little more and offer some criticism as well as some just textual analysis. But I feel like I want to just do more, be more socially engaged in my work as a scholar. It's something that this movement has impressed upon me personally anyway.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I'm so grateful for you agreeing to do this talk. So I understand that we're getting some questions in YouTube about how we recommend teaching Whitman in relationship to race. And I know you still choose to continue to teach Whitman. And so I'd like to throw that question to you. How do you handle this in the classroom? How do you handle these concerns?
Sometimes it's interesting. I taught Whitman in my composition classes where, those are like first year writing classes. And we just, there's limitations with how deep you can get into these things. I teach at a teaching intensive institution, by the way, so we do a lot of classes like, introduction to writing or introduction to composition classes for first year students where they're really not that interested in this, in all the scholarly conversations. I do teach some American literature classes where we can get a little deeper into these things. And I, like to bring it up front. That's the way I deal with it, is to, talk about it up front. This was someone who we're going to be reading, who, there's a history of him making racist comments about Black people, and we're going to deal with that. In the same way that when I approach a text where there's depictions of sexual assault, for instance, that's not something I want my students to be blindsided by, halfway through the semester when we read it. So, we can make fun of trigger warnings, and you can call it that if you want to. But that's something I try to do in my class when I know that there's going to be, contentious conversations happening. And certainly when I teach American literature, we're going to be talking about slavery, we're going to talk about racism. So there are going to be moments where you're going to have to, see some racist terms, and we're going to talk about issues that might be very sensitive. And, I've had some conflicts with students over these things before. So that happens. But I think it's important. I think it's important just to contextualize that from the beginning, that these are conversations that we're going to have, so that they're not just taken aback when we get into some of the racist language that you might come across if you're reading more about Whitman.
Sure. Yeah. Are there writers that who you have at one time appreciated and maybe taught who when you learned about their racist or other kinds of bigoted views that you just said enough? Like for me personally, when I found out about the full scope of Ezra Pound's anti-Semitism and his views on fascism, I dumped him. I haven't read him or taught him for 20 years, I think, something like that. Are there writers like that for you? It sounds like Whitman hasn't been thrown off the boat yet. But are there other writers that's happened to you just like too much?
It's funny you mentioned one of the artists who I mentioned in that essay was Kanye. So that's somebody who I don't mess with anymore. Speaking of somebody who's like very, full of himself, I think in some ways he is kind of a modern day Whitman. I celebrate myself sort of guy. But hanging out with Trump and all the MAGA hat stuff and this whole like cult thing that he's trying to do now, I don't really rock with him too much anymore. So
I think I saw that phrase "cancel Kanye" on somewhere on the news recently.
Yeah,
it's funny. Yeah, another writer who that came up for me was HP Lovecraft.
Yeah,
I hadn't read him since I was a kid, and I just remembered tentacle monsters and stuff. I know he was like super popular with horror fans and things like that. So I was teaching this class called Myth and Magic in American Literature, and I threw his The Horror at Red Hook, his story on that. And I was just appalled by how racist it was. All these like tribal Black people like summoning demons to take revenge on the white world, just explicitly white supremacist and totally there in the work, not like Whitman's journalism hidden back here. And it's right in your face in each story. And I was embarrassed that I honestly, to tell you the truth, I didn't reread the story before I taught it. And I still am embarrassed about that to this day. I feel like that was one of my big failings as a teacher. Yeah. So I've thrown him out too.
There are levels to this, Lovecraft, some of the stuff, as you said, it's just explicit. And I know there's been a lot of controversy over that, like the World Fantasy Awards, I think was where they had a sculpture of him was the award, and some people criticized them for keeping that statue as the award.
Right.
So I mean that's again, that's very different from someone like Whitman, where there's a few things he said that are a little bit problematic, and somebody like Lovecraft, who's just straight up like horrible racism.
Don't even get into his journals. I actually did more research, and he at one point referred to Hitler as his boy.
Yeah.
And he was
strong. Yeah, I know that about him.
Explicitly calling for death to Jews, things like that. Anyways, like, yeah. And then, of course, he also like wrote 100 years after Whitman. You would think that maybe he would have learned something by then, but guess not. All right. Well, I'm wondering if people have more questions for us now. We were told to leave 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the talk. So maybe this would be a good time to turn to our YouTube audience and see if there are things on people's mind. Maybe if Karen wants to join us again.
I am delighted to do it. Thank you both, Lavelle and Matt, for an incredible conversation. This has been generous and focused and centered and I feel like I wanted to keep going. We promised we would end at 7 p.m. And actually, Lavelle, I can't believe how kind of focused you are with the baby in the house now. Congratulations again on the new arrival in your home.
Thank you. Yeah, he's in the other room, so he's been quiet so far.
Amazing. There are some questions, and you know what? I'm going to be really selfish and ask one of my own. Is that okay, guys?
Sure.
Lavelle, maybe you've heard about this too. Matt and the Whitman Initiative, we've been actively engaged in a conversation about the move to remove a Whitman statue on the Camden campus of Rutgers University. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I learned about it from the advertisement for Ed Folsom's talk, and he mentioned it in the talk. So, that was really my first time hearing any details about it. Yeah.
So there is a petition up on change.org with about 3,000 signatures. And I'm looking at it right now. Someone at Rutgers put this up, and it begins, "We are calling for the removal of the Walt Whitman statue, which stands tall in the middle of our campus. Rutgers Camden has been making efforts recently to remove symbols around our campus, which continue to perpetuate a racist past. I believe that the statue of Walt Whitman glorifies a man who we should not hold such a place of honor on our campus. Our school encourages inclusion, diversity, and equity, while Whitman stood for none of those things. He instead stood for white supremacy and racism against Black and Indigenous Americans." So I'm bringing this up because you both spoke so eloquently about Whitman and the body. This, of course, ties in with the body as well, and with, in general, kind of approaching Whitman's racism. What do we do with this statue? Do either of you have a word to say about that?
Well, my thing, in the article, I tried to strike a balance where I didn't refute what like Timothy McNair said, also cited C.A. Conrad's piece, and I didn't refute that either. C.A. Conrad basically said that they weren't going to read Whitman's poetry anymore. And I respect that. And, I respect folks who decided that they wanted to remove this statue from there. I don't necessarily think that statement that Whitman, only stood for white supremacy, or I can't remember the exact phrasing of it. The last part of that statement, I'm just like, I don't know if that's really accurate. And maybe if there was a conversation about his work, people might choose differently. But, this is a moment of reckoning. And, some of our treasured symbols are going to have to change. So, maybe this is one of those moments where, if the students on the campus are organized about it, maybe they should. Yeah.
I pretty much agree with Lavelle. I'm not particularly concerned about the removal of the statue. Camden is a highly African-American community. It may not be the right statue for them. I think every community should decide for themselves their own standards about what's appropriate to maintain in public spaces. Also, like Lavelle, I'm a little more concerned about the statement and the way it's been described, the way Whitman's vision's been described, than the statue removal itself. Because Whitman stood for a lot of things. And for me, when you look to what somebody stood for, you look at their published work, not what they wrote and erased in their journals, or what somebody dug up from an obscure piece of anonymous journalism. From that point of view, Whitman stood for a kind of liberating idea of democratic equality that was utopian and impossible, but kind of a beautiful vision. And that has inspired many people and still does.
Yeah. And it's important to have, statues in our public sphere that are representative of the diversity of the people. That reminded me of the issue in New York, where there are only 5 statues of historic women in New York City, in all of New York City. And it's just like, okay, if these statues are meant to represent history, that's not a very representative view of history. So yeah, I think our public celebrations, I think, should be questioned, and we should be thinking about ways to make our public infrastructure more representative of the diversity of our people.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Whitman himself wrote against monuments. in specimen days. I have it right in front of me. He, in this short section called Monuments, the Past and Present, he wrote, "I am not sure, but the day for conventional monuments, statues, memorials, etc., has passed away, and that they are henceforth superfluous and vulgar." So I wonder if Walt himself would have, condoned the erection of these statues. But thank you for that. I want to turn to some of the questions that are out there. We have a number of questions appearing in the chat, and I'm going to encourage people to keep on putting them in there because we have about 10 minutes. There is a question from Maureen Fathom, and she compliments both of you with a fabulous convo. And this question goes to you, Lavelle. Fascinated by the insights re Whitman's attraction to the Black body and his dehumanizing perspective re Black people. And she's curious what theories you're using next to that issue.
Hi, Maureen. I know Maureen from the Graduate Center. I was a student of Robert Reed Farr at the Graduate Center. He's written quite a bit about race and sexuality in his work, Black Gay Man, and Once You Go Black. Got Choice, Desire, and The Black American. So, Reed Farr's work on race and sexuality is something I'm thinking about. Siobhan Somerville's Squaring the Color Line is another work that I think of. Roderick Ferguson's Aberrations in Black, where he talks about, sociology and the construction of Blackness and the Black family in sociological thinking. So these are some of the books that I kind of are thinking about when it comes to the way that Black people are often viewed as sexually different by white supremacist thinking.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, there are suggestions in his writings that he may have even had a Black lover. Matt, I don't know if you ever go there in your writing, but I know some people kind of interpret the sleepers that way with "darkness, you are gentler than my lover" and so forth. But thank you so much, Lavelle. I'm looking at the other questions, and we've got one from our own Tristan, and this one probably goes more to you, Matt, but I think both of you could maybe try it out. Do you think the repression that Whitman felt finally broke him and he finally became more racist when he realized that he wouldn't find liberation for his sexuality? Could it be possible that he was projecting his pain onto others like him who were looked at as a degenerate in the eyes of society? This way he could have some sort of power in society.
It's an interesting idea, but I don't see any real evidence for it in the notebooks. It's pretty speculative. I wouldn't excuse Whitman's racist statements on that. I do think there's a connection between his erotic outlook toward other men and the failure of that outlook and his increasing racism, but I'm not sure I would put it in quite the, I guess, sort of pseudo-Freudian way that Tristan did there. I don't know if it's directly related to repression and projection and that, but I would say that as he became less sort of sexually alive as a man, I think his ability to feel compassion for Black men decreased, and there is something there, but I'm not sure I would put it in the kind of Freudian terms that statement did. What do you think, Lavelle?
I think in a sort of historical perspective on his late, life racism is, post-Civil War America and the process of Reconstruction, and the idea of reconciling the South and the North, and that reconciliation really happened around like white supremacy, and so I think in some ways I wonder, and as women scholars, maybe you can check me and let me know whether that's accurate or not. But I think the political environment of that time and attitudes about Black people during the post-Civil War era, as emancipation actually took hold, and when you started to see Black people participating in the nation, there's this real backlash, and a lot of scientific racism becomes very prevalent as a justification for why the color line needs to remain. If they were going to let them run around free, we need to make sure that they're contained because they are inferior, and here are the reasons why. So I think it was just the racial thinking of his time that influenced some of the things that he might have said later in his life. But that's just a guess. Again, having since you've been in the notebooks, maybe you could corroborate whether that's accurate.
I share that guess. In particular, the part that I share is the increasing influence on scientific or pseudoscientific racial theories that position the white body as at the apex of human development. These variants of social Darwinism. Herbert Spencer, the inventor of social Darwinism, was a contemporary of Whitman's, roughly the same era. Whitman certainly encountered his work. And he was one of the most, I guess you could say, trendy. It was like a fad almost for social Darwinism. And some of these people that got into it are people that you would expect to buy into racist views, but others you're really kind of disappointed at how thoroughly they bought into this thoroughly racist outlook, which basically says that eventually all Black people will either die off or become assimilated. And that's viewed as a positive development. Explicitly as a positive development. So this is a violent racist ideology. There's no excusing it. It can also be tied directly to the Holocaust. It's been misused over the decades in countless ways, and it's, I think, one of the most destructive concepts to take hold of the white intellectual imagination in the last 2 centuries. And Whitman bought into it too, and he deserves all the blame for that.
Thank you both for that. Very powerful. I'm looking at a question that probably ties in with how you are talking right now. And this comes from Tanika Martin, who happens to be a Whitman student of mine from way back, but still following all things Whitman. And she asks, isn't it important to consider Whitman in the context of his time, not our time? And this reminds me of now the discussions of presentism, right? Any thoughts on this? And this might well be our last question, guys. We're at 6:56, so final words on that?
Well, I think if that's the last question, it's a good one to end on, because I think that's really what's at stake here. And hopefully over this conversation, we've tried to contextualize Whitman's comments in his own time, just as we were talking about some of the ideas about race that were circulating in his own time as well. But we do read these, authors in our own time as well, right? The 200th anniversary fell during the Trump administration. That was kind of something that I was grappling with in that article. There's this moment of resurgent white nationalism. And so we have to consider why we are willing to make excuses for white supremacy when it pops up in these writers' writing, particularly at a moment like this. So yes, you do have to contextualize the writing in its own time. But also there were other people in that time who were not racist. There were also other people there who saw the humanity of Black people. So, it isn't, when some people make these comments, they're suggesting that everybody was a white supremacist in that moment. And that's just simply not true. So the other thing I'll say about it is that I think there is a side of this that should encourage some humility in us, and thinking about what are some of the things that we're contributing to, or what are some of the things that we're ignoring in our own time that people in the future might look at us and say, why didn't you do something about that thing that was happening? Or why did you have those views about the people that you had those views about?
I love that. And the only thing I want to add to it is that I think it needs to be a constant ongoing negotiation. We can't get too comfortable in our position about what history is teaching us, that we need to keep checking in and keep questioning our canonical, the authors we choose to keep teaching, and their relationship to history. We're not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
I love everything Lavelle said just there. It's I think a great way to end the talk.
Wow, thank you both for just straight shooting answers. Bad word to use for Walt Whitman, I suppose, but there goes. A wonderfully rich conversation that I hope a lot of us get to revisit since we're going to install this on the Walt Whitman Initiative YouTube channel. Any final words, guys?
Check in a week for Jesse, for your and Jesse's talk. Walt Whitman's New York. It's going to be a fascinating talk, and I hope everybody comes back. I'll be there, and looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, and I am looking forward to that as well. Definitely, I'll be there.
Just one other thing, if anybody would like to sign our petition to try to save the last remaining Walt Whitman house, on 99 Ryerson. Please visit the Walt Whitman Initiative's website. Just do a Google search for Walt Whitman Initiative, and you can find links to the petition through our main page. We're trying to save the last remaining house that Whitman lived in Brooklyn.
Okay, Matt and Lavelle, thank you so much. Also a shout out again to Jesse Morandi behind the scenes there and Tristan Pullen. They've made it work, and thus ends our first ever speaker series talk, and I think it was fantastic. You guys put the conversation in conversation. That was a word that was often repeated here, and I feel like keeping the conversation open is kind of the big message that I'm getting from this. So thank you both. Hope to see you all